I woke up to find a bold, red-stamped eviction notice nailed to my ranch gate at sunrise, fluttering in the wind like a warning flag. The morning mist was still rolling off the fields when I stumbled out to check on the cattle, my boots crunching through the frost-kissed grass. The familiar sounds of home greeted me, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the old windmill, the sweet smell of hay carried on the dawn breeze. This was my sanctuary, my slice of heaven carved out of the Texas hill country, where 3 generations of my family had worked the land and raised livestock. But there it was, that damned piece of paper, violent red ink screaming against the weathered wood of my gate like a bloody handprint. My hands shook as I tore it loose, the cheap paper crackling in the cool air. Notice of violation and demand for immediate compliance. It read, in bold, bureaucratic letters that made my stomach churn. The Meadowbrook Valley Homeowners Association hereby demands the immediate removal of all livestock, commercial vehicles, farm equipment, and non-conforming fencing from the property located at 1247 Ranch Road. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in legal action and forced eviction. I read it 3 times, my disbelief growing with each pass. Commercial vehicles? They were talking about my pickup truck and the old Ford tractor that had been running since my grandfather's time. Non-conforming fencing? The split-rail fence that had stood for decades, weathered and honest, marking the boundaries my family had defended through drought, recession, and everything else life had thrown at us. The letter was signed with a flourish by one Margaret Hutchins, President, Meadowbrook Valley HOA, a woman I'd seen around town with her perfectly coiffed hair and designer handbags, always looking like she'd stepped out of some suburban magazine. She'd moved to our valley 5 years ago with her developer husband, bringing their city rules and their need to control everything in sight. I'd watched them systematically target the old-timers, one property at a time, forcing out the farmers and ranchers who'd built this community with their bare hands. My chest tightened with a cocktail of shock and rising fury. This wasn't just about zoning violations or HOA aesthetics. This was war. A war against everything I stood for. Everything my family had built. Everything that made this valley worth living in. The cattle wandered closer, curious about my unusual morning behavior, their breath creating small clouds in the crisp air. My quarter horse, Thunder, nickered from the near pasture, probably wondering why I was standing there holding a piece of paper like it might bite me. These animals depended on me. This land wasn't just my home. It was their home, their livelihood, their very existence. I thought about my grandfather, who'd bought this land with money saved from 2 tours in Vietnam. I thought about my father, who'd expanded the herd and weathered the agricultural crisis of the 80s without losing a single acre. They'd faced down drought, disease, and economic collapse, but they'd never faced anything like this. Bureaucrats with clipboards trying to erase their legacy with the stroke of a pen. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist and revealing the full beauty of my property. 500 acres of rolling pasture, dotted with oak trees and crossed by a clear-running creek. This wasn't suburban sprawl or cookie-cutter development. This was working land, productive land, land. That meant something. I crumpled the notice in my fist, feeling the paper compress into a tight ball. Part of me wanted to throw it in the creek and pretend it never existed. But that wouldn't make Margaret Hutchins and her HOA army disappear. They'd be back, probably with lawyers and county officials, and all the bureaucratic muscle they could muster. Walking back toward the house, I passed the old barn where my grandfather had taught me to rope. where my father had shown me how to deliver a calf, where 3 generations of family memories lived in every weathered board and rusty nail. The morning light slanted through the open doors, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the golden air. I stopped at the porch and turned back toward the gate, where the nail holes from their notice now marked my fence like tiny wounds. The wind picked up, rustling through the grass and carrying the scent of wild flowers and cattle and earth, the smell of freedom, of independence, of a way of life that was becoming rarer every day. Thunder trotted closer to the fence. His ears pricked forward, as if sensing the tension in the air. I walked over and stroked his neck, feeling the solid warmth of his muscles beneath my palm. This horse had carried me through countless sunrises just like this one, across every inch of this property, through seasons of plenty and seasons of struggle. "They picked the wrong ranch to mess with," I whispered, the words carried away on the wind but burning bright in my chest. The crumpled notice felt heavy in my pocket as I headed inside to make coffee and figure out my next move. Margaret Hutchins and her HOA might think they had all the power, all the legal authority, all the resources to crush one stubborn rancher. But they were about to learn something my grandfather had taught me long ago. Never start a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for. The war for Meadowbrook Valley had begun, and I intended to win it. Before I fight, you need to understand why this land isn't just dirt and fences. It's blood, history, and a bond deeper than the HOA could ever comprehend. The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth as I sat on my porch that morning, watching the sun climb higher over the valley that had shaped 3 generations of my family. Margaret Hutchins and her administrative vultures saw property values and zoning compliance, but when I looked across these rolling hills, I saw something they'd never understand. Legacy written in soil and sweat, carved from wilderness by people who understood that some things are worth more than money. My great-grandfather, Samuel McKinnon, first set foot on this land in 1952, fresh back from Korea, with army pay burning a hole in his pocket and a dream of raising cattle in Texas Hill country. The original homestead was nothing but a 2-room shack and 40 acres of scrubland. But Sam had vision. He saw water rights along Willow Creek, grazing potential in the native grass, and most importantly, he saw freedom. The kind of freedom that comes from working land you own, answering to nobody but the weather and the market. Sam's son, my grandfather Robert, inherited more than just the land. He inherited the stubborn streak that kept this place running through droughts that killed neighboring ranches, through the cattle market crash of '74, through the savings and loan crisis that claimed half the family farms in the county. Robert expanded the original 40 acres to 500, built the barn that still stands today, and established the bloodlines that made McKinnon Ranch cattle some of the most sought after in 3 counties. When my father took over in '85, the agricultural world was changing fast. Corporate farming was crushing family operations, environmental regulations were tightening, and suburban sprawl was creeping into rural areas like a slow-moving disease. Dad adapted where he could, diversified where he had to, and never backed down from a fight when the future of the ranch was at stake. He added the horse breeding program, leased hunting rights during deer season, and did whatever it took to keep the land in the family. Then came the accident. A rollover with the big John Deere during hay season 7 years ago now. Dad lingered in the hospital for 3 weeks before his body finally gave out, leaving me with 500 acres, 200 head of cattle, a mortgage that would choke a horse, and the weight of 70 years of family tradition on my shoulders. I'd been working the ranch alongside Dad since I was old enough to hold a rope. so the physical work wasn't the problem. The problem was carrying the emotional load, being the last McKinnon standing between this land and whatever forces wanted to tear it down. Some nights I'd walk out to the far pasture where we'd buried Dad's favorite cutting horse, Thunder's sire, and I'd talk to both of them like they were still listening. Maybe they were. Maybe they were. The valley had changed around me these past few years. Where once there had been nothing but working ranches and family farms, now there were clusters of million-dollar houses built by city folks who wanted the rural lifestyle without any of the realities that came with it. They complained about the smell of cattle, the noise of roosters, the dust from harvest season. They wanted postcard-pretty countryside with all the inconveniences sanitized away. Margaret Hutchins was the worst of the bunch. She and her developer, husband, Richard, had moved from Dallas with plans to improve the area, which translated to forcing out anyone whose property didn't meet their suburban aesthetic standards. They'd started the Meadowbrook Valley HOA with promises of preserving property values and maintaining community standards, but everyone could see what they were really doing, systematically targeting the old-timers who'd built this valley with their own hands. The Garcias had been first. 3 generations of their family had run a small farm on the north side of the valley, growing vegetables and raising chickens. The HOA hit them with violation after violation. Their chicken coop was too close to the property line. Their farm stand was operating without proper permits. Their roosters were creating a noise nuisance. The legal fees alone drove them into bankruptcy, and last spring they sold out to a developer who turned their farmland into 4 oversized houses with manicured lawns. Then came old Pete Morrison, whose family had been blacksmithing and horse training in the valley since the 1940s. The HOA declared his forge a fire hazard and his outdoor training arena visually non-compliant. Pete fought them for 2 years, spending his retirement savings on lawyers, before finally giving up and moving to his daughter's place in Oklahoma. His property got divided into 3 lots, each one sporting a house that looked like it belonged, in a magazine spread rather than cattle country. The widow Patterson was next. They went after her for the unapproved flower garden she'd been tending for 30 years, claiming it violated setback requirements and water usage restrictions. Sarah Patterson was 82 years old and had been growing prize-winning roses since before Margaret Hutchins was born. But that didn't matter to the HOA. They fined her, threatened liens, and harassed her until she finally moved in with her son in Austin. Her cottage got torn down 6 months later, replaced by something that looked like a suburban strip mall with windows. I'd watched it all happen, watched my neighbors and friends get picked off one by one, their history erased, and their contributions forgotten. Each time, I'd told myself that my situation was different, that my ranch was too big and too established for them to touch. I had water rights, mineral rights, agricultural exemptions, and 70 years of continuous operation. I thought I was safe. That was before the notice on my gate. Now, sitting on my porch with that crumpled piece of paper in my pocket, I realized that safety was an illusion. The HOA had been working their way up to me, eliminating the smaller properties. First, building their legal muscle and their political connections. I wasn't just the last independent operator in the valley. I was the biggest prize, the final obstacle to their vision of suburbanized perfection. But they'd picked the wrong fight this time. The McKinnons had been defending this land for 70 years, and we'd gotten good at it. We'd survived drought, disease, market crashes, and government interference. We'd buried our dead in this soil and raised our children under this sky. This wasn't just a business or an investment to us. This was home in the deepest sense of the word. The sun was approaching noon when I noticed the white SUV driving slowly past my front gate. the driver taking pictures with a long-lens camera. Then another car, this one a silver sedan with tinted windows, doing the same thing. The HOA patrol had begun, documenting every fence post and feed trough, building their case with the methodical patience of predators circling wounded prey. Thought about calling my lawyer, but John Davidson was a good man in his 70s who specialized in wills and property transfers, not warfare with homeowner associations. I thought about calling the county commissioner, but half the county commission was already in Margaret Hutchins's pocket, bought and paid for with campaign contributions and promises of increased tax revenue from all those new developments. No, this fight was going to require different tactics, different allies, and a different kind of strategy. The HOA thought they knew everything about me and my ranch, thought they'd done their homework, and identified all my vulnerabilities. But there were things about this property, things about my lease agreements and my business partnerships that weren't listed on any public records or zoning maps. As the afternoon wore on and more cars crawled past my gate like hungry vultures, I found myself thinking about a conversation I'd had with my father just weeks before his accident. He'd been updating the ranch's business records, filing paperwork with various government agencies, ensuring that all our agreements and contracts were current and legally sound. "Son," he'd said, looking up from a folder thick with official documents, "sometimes the best way to protect what's yours is to share it with someone who can't be pushed around." At the time, I'd assumed he was talking about insurance policies or business partnerships. Now, as I watched the HOA's surveillance operation gear up outside my gate, I began to understand what he'd really meant. The war was coming, whether I wanted it or not, but I wouldn't be fighting it alone, and I wouldn't be fighting it defenseless. The HOA was about to learn that some battles aren't won by the side with the most money or the best lawyers. They're won by the side that understands the terrain, respects the history, and fights for something that can't be bought or sold or zoned out of existence. This was my valley, my land, my heritage, and I'd be damned if I'd let Margaret Hutchins and her suburban army take it without the fight of their lives. By the end of that week, it felt like I was living under siege, not by criminals, but by clipboards and HOA regulations. The harassment started small, the way cancer starts small, with symptoms you might ignore until they metastasize into something that threatens to kill everything you hold dear. Tuesday morning brought the first wave of fines, delivered not by mail, but stuffed into my mailbox like anonymous threats, each one stamped with the official seal of the Meadowbrook Valley HOA and Margaret Hutchins's flowing signature. Violation. Notice, Sector 447B, Excessive Noise Ordinance. The document claimed that my cattle were creating unreasonable disturbance during morning feeding times. Apparently, the sound of 200 head moving through the pasture violated the association's quiet enjoyment provisions. The fine was $500, with an additional $50 per day until the noise source was eliminated. I laughed out loud reading that one, standing there in my driveway with the morning sun warming my shoulders and the sound of cattle lowing peacefully in the distance. These were the same sounds that had echoed across this valley for 70 years, long before Margaret Hutchins ever set foot in Texas. But my laughter died when I saw the next fine. Violation Notice Number 52C, Unauthorized Commercial Vehicle Storage. They were targeting my work trucks, the 2018 F-250 I used for feed runs, and the older Chevy that served as backup during busy seasons. According to the HOA, any vehicle over a certain weight class constituted commercial equipment and required special permits to park on residential property, another $500 plus daily penalties. The third notice made my blood pressure spike. Violation. Notice. Notter 61A. Non-conforming agricultural structures. They wanted me to remove the feed troughs, claiming they were temporary structures that violated setback requirements and aesthetic guidelines. Never mind that those troughs had been anchored in concrete for 20 years and served a vital function in keeping my livestock healthy and fed. But the notice that really got under my skin was the fourth one. Violation notice number 78D, unapproved water usage. They were threatening to contact the county utilities department about my irrigation system, claiming that agricultural water usage exceeded residential limits. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an attack on the basic infrastructure that kept my ranch operational. I crumpled the notices and threw them in the truck, then drove into town to grab supplies and try to clear my head. But even in town, I could feel the HOA's influence spreading like a stain. At Miller's feed store, where I'd been buying grain and hay for 10 years, the owner, Jim Miller, pulled me aside with a worried expression. Jake, I hate to say this, but I got a call yesterday from some woman claiming to represent the Homeowners Association. She was asking about your account, wanting to know how much feed you buy, how often you pick up supplies. I told her to mind her own damn business, but he shrugged helplessly. She mentioned something about permits for commercial livestock operations, said she was conducting an investigation into zoning violations. My hands clenched into fists. What did you tell her, Jim? Nothing that's not already public knowledge. But Jake, she knew things. Details about your operation that she shouldn't know unless she's been watching you real close. Be careful, son. These people aren't playing games. The drive home was a blur of anger and disbelief. Margaret Hutchins wasn't just targeting my property with fines. She was conducting surveillance, gathering intelligence, building a comprehensive case designed to shut down every aspect of my operation. This was psychological warfare designed to make me feel isolated, overwhelmed, and ultimately defeated. Wednesday brought a new escalation. I woke up to find my water turned off, not by the county utilities department, but by someone who'd apparently accessed the main line where it crossed under the country road. When I called the water company, they claimed no work was scheduled for my area and no service interruptions had been reported. It took 6 hours and a service call. I couldn't afford to get water flowing again. Thursday, someone had strung yellow caution tape across the entrance to my back pasture, the kind used for construction zones. When I cut it down, I found a printed sign claiming the area was under environmental review for potential water contamination. The sign bore no official agency markings, but it looked official enough to fool a casual observer. Friday brought the anonymous complaints, phone calls to the county animal control office claiming that my cattle were roaming free and posed a danger to public safety. Never mind that my fences were solid and my cattle hadn't left the property in 7 years. The county was obligated to investigate every complaint, which meant officials trudging through my pastures, disrupting my routine, and adding an official stamp to the harassment campaign. But Margaret Hutchins was just getting started. That weekend, she held a special meeting of the Meadowbrook Valley HOA, ostensibly to discuss community safety concerns, but really to showcase her campaign against me. I didn't attend, but my neighbor, Carlos Mendoza, did, and he filled me in on the details over coffee Sunday morning. She had a whole presentation, Jake, Carlos said, shaking his head in disgust. Charts and graphs and photographs of your property taken with telephoto lenses. She called your ranch a blight on the community and claimed that agricultural operations were driving down property values for everyone else. Carlos ran a small auto repair shop on his property, and he'd been dealing with HOA harassment for months. They'd cited him for unauthorized commercial activity and demanded he relocate his business to an industrial zone 20 miles away, despite the fact that he'd been fixing cars on his land for 15 years. She had supporters, too. Carlos continued. Maybe 20 people, all newcomers who bought houses in the last 2 years. They were nodding along with everything she said, talking about the need to modernize the valley and bring it up to contemporary standards. One woman actually suggested that livestock operations should be banned entirely within the association boundaries. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father, about the pride he'd taken in building something lasting and valuable. This ranch represented 70 years of hard work, smart decisions, and stubborn determination. The idea that some suburban transplant with a clipboard could erase all of that with zoning violations and noise ordinances felt like a violation of something sacred. Monday morning brought the most brazen escalation yet. I woke up to find fresh tire tracks in my front pasture, tracks that led right up to my cattle troughs and then looped back toward the main road. Someone had been on my property in the middle of the night, taking pictures or measurements or God knows what else. I followed the tracks to where they disappeared on the county road, my anger building with every step. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was trespassing, possibly burglary, definitely intimidation. But what could I do? Call the sheriff and report mysterious tire tracks? File a complaint against people I couldn't identify? That evening, I installed motion sensor floodlights around the main buildings and started sleeping with my bedroom window open so I could hear any vehicles approaching the house. If Margaret Hutchins and her HOA army wanted to play nighttime games on my property, I'd be ready for them. I didn't have to wait long. Tuesday night, just after midnight, the floodlights exploded to life with the intensity of stadium lighting. I was out of bed and grabbing my shotgun before I was fully awake, my heart hammering as I peered through the bedroom window. 3 figures were frozen in the blazing white light like deer caught in headlights. 2 men and a woman, all wearing dark clothing and carrying cameras with long lenses. The woman was Margaret Hutchins herself, her perfectly styled hair disheveled and her face twisted with fury at being caught in the act. I threw on clothes and boots, then stepped out onto the porch with the shotgun cradled in my arms, not pointing it at anyone, just making it clear that I was armed and ready to defend my property. The floodlights had turned night into day, and I could see every detail of their faces, every piece of equipment they were carrying. "This is private property," I called out, my voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "You're trespassing, and I want you gone. Now." Margaret Hutchins tried to regain her composure, smoothing her hair and straightening her jacket like she was preparing for a business meeting rather than explaining why she was skulking around my ranch at midnight. "Mr. McKinnon, we're conducting a lawful investigation into zoning violations and potential environmental hazards," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. "As representatives of the Homeowners Association, we have a right to document conditions that affect property values and community safety." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. You have a right to trespass on private property in the middle of the night? You have a right to document my livestock and my facilities without permission? Lady, I don't think you understand how property law works in Texas. One of the men, a thin guy with a nervous twitch, started backing toward the fence line. The other, broader and more confident, stood his ground like he was used to intimidating people. But Margaret Hutchins was the one in charge, the one making the decisions, and I could see her calculating her next move. "We'll be filing a full report with the appropriate authorities," she said finally. "Your threats and your weapons won't protect you from legitimate legal action. And your midnight photography sessions won't protect you from criminal trespassing charges," I replied. "This is your one warning. The next time I find you on my property without permission, I'm calling the sheriff and pressing charges." "Are we clear?" They retreated to the fence line and climbed through where they'd cut the wire. Another violation, another piece of property damage I'd have to repair. But as they disappeared into the darkness beyond my floodlights, I realized something important had just happened. Margaret Hutchins had overplayed her hand, crossed the line from legal harassment to criminal activity, and I'd caught her in the act. The war was escalating, but for the first time since finding that notice on my gate, I felt like I had some ammunition of my own. The HOA thought they had me cornered, until I pulled out a piece of paper that made their rules worth less than dust. After the midnight encounter with Margaret Hutchins and her photography crew, I knew the time for reactive defense was over. I needed to understand exactly what legal ground I was standing on, and more importantly, what weapons I had in my arsenal that the HOA didn't know about. Wednesday morning found me in my father's old office, a cluttered room in the back of the house where 3 generations of McKinnon family business had been conducted. The office still smelled like leather and old paper, with filing cabinets that hadn't been fully organized since Dad's death 7 years ago. Most of the day-to-day ranch business was computerized now, but the really important documents, the deeds and contracts and agreements that defined the ranch's legal existence, were still kept in a fireproof safe that my grandfather had installed back in 1962. I'd avoided going through these papers for years, partly from grief and partly from the overwhelming nature of 70 years' worth of legal documents. But Margaret Hutchins had forced my hand. If I was going to fight a war, I needed to know exactly what territory I was defending and what allies I could call upon. The combination to the safe was my grandmother's birthday, and the heavy door swung open to reveal neat stacks of papers, in manila folders, each one labeled in my father's careful handwriting. Water rights, 1952, 2018. Mineral leases, 1967, present. Grazing permits, various. And there, in the back corner, a thick folder marked Federal Agreements, Confidential. My hands were shaking as I pulled out that folder, remembering something my father had said during his final weeks in the hospital. He'd been weak, fading in and out of consciousness, but he'd grabbed my arm with surprising strength and whispered, "The federal paperwork, Jake. If anyone ever tries to take the ranch, remember the federal paperwork." At the time, I'd assumed he was talking about agricultural subsidies or environmental compliance documents. Every ranch dealt with federal agencies: the Department of Agriculture, the EPA, the Bureau of Land Management. But as I opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk, I realized my father had been referring to something much more significant. The first document was stamped with the seal of the United States Army and dated 15 years ago. Land Use Agreement, it read in bold letters, between the U.S. Department of Defense and McKinnon Ranch Properties, LLC. I read it once quickly, then again more slowly, my excitement building with each line. According to the agreement, my ranch wasn't just a private cattle operation. It was a designated training facility for U.S. military personnel, leased directly to the Department of Defense under a renewable 20-year contract. The military used the property for various training exercises: land navigation, small unit tactics, survival training, and reconnaissance operations. In exchange, they paid substantial annual lease fees and provided certain legal protections for the property. But the most important clause was buried on page 7 of the contract. Lessee property shall be considered federal land for all purposes of zoning, taxation, and local regulation during the term of this agreement. Local homeowners associations, municipal authorities, and county governments shall have no jurisdiction over property use, modifications, or operations conducted under the terms of this federal lease. I read that paragraph 5 times, each reading making me grin wider. Margaret Hutchins and her HOA had been building their entire case on the assumption that they had authority over my property, that local zoning regulations and association bylaws could override my right to operate a working ranch. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. My ranch wasn't subject to HOA regulations because it wasn't technically private property during the term of the federal lease. The second document was even better, a letter from the Pentagon confirming that the lease agreement was still active and had been automatically renewed for another 10-year term. The Army had been using my land for training exercises twice a year, usually during spring and fall when the weather was favorable and the grass wasn't too high. I'd always assumed these exercises were just a side business, extra income that helped cover the ranch's operating expenses. But according to the legal language in these documents, those training exercises made my ranch a federal facility, protected by the same laws that governed military bases and government installations. Margaret Hutchins could file all the violations she wanted, but her authority stopped at my fence line. She might as well have been trying to shut down Fort Hood with Homeowners Association bylaws. The third document was a contact list for military personnel involved in administering the lease agreement. Colonel Sarah Martinez was listed as the current base commander responsible for off-site training facilities. Major David Kim handled contract administration. Sergeant Major Williams coordinated training schedules and security protocols. I picked up the phone and dialed Colonel Martinez's office, my heart pounding as I waited for someone to answer. A crisp, professional voice came on the line. Colonel Martinez's office, Staff Sergeant Thompson speaking. This is Jake McKinnon from McKinnon Ranch Properties, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to speak with Colonel Martinez about our land use agreement. One moment, sir. There was a brief pause. Then, Colonel Martinez is in meetings this morning, but she can call you back this afternoon. Is this regarding the spring training exercise? No, this is about a legal issue affecting the property. I need to discuss the federal protections outlined in our lease agreement. The sergeant's tone became more serious. I'll make sure the colonel gets your message, Mr. McKinnon. She'll want to discuss any legal issues that might affect our training operations. After I hung up, I sat back in my father's old chair and tried to process what I'd discovered. For years, I'd been sitting on the perfect defense against exactly the kind of harassment Margaret Hutchins was dishing out, and I hadn't even known it. The federal lease agreement didn't just provide legal protection, it provided the kind of protection that trumped local authority completely. But I also realized that this information was a double-edged sword. Once I played this card, there would be no going back. The HOA would know that their tactics had been completely ineffective, that they'd been fighting a battle they could never win. Margaret Hutchins would be humiliated, and humiliated bullies tend to become even more dangerous and unpredictable. Colonel Martinez called back that afternoon, and her voice carried the no-nonsense authority of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions under pressure. Mr. McKinnon, I understand you're having some trouble with local authorities regarding your property. Yes, ma'am. The local homeowners association is trying to shut down my ranching operation, claiming various zoning violations and regulatory issues. They don't seem to understand that the property is under federal lease. I see. There was a pause, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Mr. McKinnon, I want to be very clear about something. The Department of Defense takes its lease agreements seriously, and we don't appreciate interference from local busybodies who don't understand federal jurisdiction. Your ranch is critical to our training operations, and any attempt to disrupt those operations will be met with appropriate federal response. My grin was so wide it hurt. So if the HOA continues their harassment campaign, you'll intervene? Mr. McKinnon, if anyone tries to shut down a federal training facility, they'll find themselves dealing with the United States Army. I suggest you inform these homeowners association people that they're way out of their league. That evening, I drove into town and made copies of the lease agreement, the renewal letter, and the contact information for the military personnel. I put copies in my truck, copies in the house, and copies in my safety deposit box at the bank. Then I sat on my porch with a beer and watched the sun set over my valley, feeling like a man who'd just discovered he'd been carrying a loaded gun all along. Margaret Hutchins and her HOA had picked the wrong fight. They'd assumed they were battling a simple rancher with limited resources and no political connections. Instead, they'd declared war on the United States military. Tomorrow, I'd start letting them know exactly what that meant. The next morning brought another batch of violation notices in my mailbox, but this time I just smiled as I read them. Noise violations, commercial vehicle infractions, unauthorized agricultural structures, the same complaints, the same threats, the same attempt to intimidate me into submission. But this time, instead of anger or worry, I felt something close to pity for Margaret Hutchins. She was like a small-town dictator who'd just discovered that her tiny kingdom was actually occupied territory, and the real army was about to arrive. I picked up my phone and dialed her number, which was listed on every violation notice as the EID contact for compliance questions. She answered on the second ring, her voice syrupy with false politeness. Margaret Hutchins speaking. How may I help you? Ms. Hutchins, this is Jake McKinnon. I wanted to thank you for all the violation notices you've been sending. They've been very educational. Mr. McKinnon, I hope you're calling to discuss your compliance timeline. The Homeowners Association is prepared to work with you on a reasonable schedule for correcting these violations. Actually, I'm calling to let you know that you might want to review the federal land use agreements for my property. I think you'll find them very interesting reading. There was a long pause. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mr. McKinnon. I'm referring to the fact that my ranch is leased to the United States Army as a training facility, which places it under federal jurisdiction. Your homeowners association has about as much authority over my property as it does over Fort Hood. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, her voice came back, much less confident than before. That's impossible. This property is clearly within the association boundaries. We have zoning maps, legal descriptions. Ms. Hutchins, I suggest you contact your lawyers and have them research federal preemption laws. You might also want to call Colonel Sarah Martinez at Fort Hood and explain why you've been harassing one of their training facilities. I hung up before she could respond, then sat back and smiled. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had just shifted dramatically. Margaret Hutchins was about to discover that there are some battles you simply can't win, no matter how many clipboards and violation notices you bring to the fight. Hartfintoin wasn't just fighting for my ranch anymore. I was fighting for everyone this HOA had bullied into silence. The call from Colonel Martinez had given me the nuclear option I needed to end Margaret Hutchins's harassment campaign. But as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun paint my valley in shades of gold and amber, I realized that simply ending my own fight wasn't enough. Margaret Hutchins and her HOA had been systematically destroying this community for years, driving out families who'd built their lives here, erasing history and heritage one violation notice at a time. I thought about the Garcias, forced off their family farm by relentless harassment. I thought about Pete Morrison, whose generations-old blacksmith operation had been regulated out of existence. I thought about Sarah Patterson, an 82-year-old widow fined into submission for growing roses in her own yard. These weren't just casualties in someone else's war. They were my neighbors, my friends, people who'd welcomed me into this valley and stood by my family through good times and bad. The federal lease agreement was my get-out-of-jail-free card. But it wouldn't help anyone else. If I just used it to protect my ranch and then disappeared into my own private fortress, Margaret Hutchins would continue picking off the remaining holdouts one by one until nothing was left but cookie-cutter developments and suburban conformity. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight this battle alone, and I wasn't going to fight it just for myself. I was going to rally every person in this valley who'd been bullied, harassed, or driven away by the HOA's reign of terror. We were going to make a stand not just for property rights, but for the kind of community that had made Meadowbrook Valley worth living in for generations. My first call was to Carlos Mendoza, my neighbor who ran the auto repair shop that the HOA had been trying to shut down for months. Carlos had been fighting his own losing battle against violation notices and compliance demands, spending his savings on lawyers and permits for a business he'd been operating legally for 15 years. Carlos, it's Jake McKinnon. Can you come over tonight? I've got something important to show you. Jake, if this is about the HOA, I don't know what more we can do. My lawyer says, Carlos, trust me on this. What I've found changes everything. An hour later, Carlos sat in my father's office, his weathered hands holding the federal lease agreement like it was made of gold. His eyes grew wider with each page, and by the time he finished reading, he was shaking his head in amazement. Jesus, Jake, you've been sitting on this the whole time? I didn't know what it meant until yesterday. My dad left it in the safe, but I never bothered to read through all the legal language. Carlos, this doesn't just protect me. It proves that the HOA has been operating outside their authority from the beginning. If they can't legally regulate a federal training facility, what makes them think they can regulate any of the original properties in this valley? Carlos leaned back in his chair, his mechanic's mind already working through the implications. You're talking about challenging the entire HOA structure. I'm talking about fighting back. But I can't do it alone. I need allies, people who've been hurt by these bastards, people who remember what this valley used to be like before Margaret Hutchins and her suburban army showed up. Who else you thinking about? I pulled out a piece of paper where I'd been making notes. Tom Bradley still owns the old dairy farm on the east side, even though they forced him to sell his cattle last year. Maria Santos has been fighting them over her horse training operation. And there are others, people who've been keeping their heads down, paying their fines, hoping the HOA would leave them alone if they just complied. And the people who already got forced out? Some of them might be willing to help, especially if we can prove the HOA exceeded their legal authority. The Garcias still have family here. Pete Morrison's son lives over in Cedar Park. He might want to see his father's legacy vindicated. Carlos stood up and paced to the window, looking out at the darkness where his own shop sat under the threat of HOA shutdown. Jake, this is bigger than just fighting violation notices. You're talking about taking on the entire power structure that's been reshaping this valley? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Margaret Hutchins and her allies have been systematically destroying everything that made this community special. They've been picking us off one by one because they figured we'd never organize, never fight back as a group. Well, they figured wrong. We spent the next 2 hours making phone calls. Tom Bradley drove over from his dairy farm, still wearing work clothes that smelled of hay and sweat. Maria Santos arrived on horseback, literally, tying her mare to my fence post like this was 1875 instead of 2024. By midnight, we had 7 people gathered around my kitchen table, sharing stories of HOA harassment and discussing strategies for fighting back. Tom Bradley, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd been dairy farming in the valley for 30 years, told us about the health department inspection that had shut down his operation. They claimed my milk storage didn't meet residential standards, he said, his voice bitter with old frustration. Never mind that I'd been selling milk to local families for decades without a single complaint. Never mind that I had all the proper agricultural permits and health certificates. Maria Santos, whose family had been training horses in Texas for 4 generations, described the noise complaints that had forced her to move her operation indoors. They said the sound of horses cantering was disturbing the peace, she said, her dark eyes flashing with anger. These people move to ranch country and then complain about ranch sounds. It's like moving next to an airport and complaining about airplanes. But the most powerful testimony came from Elena Garcia, whose family had been forced off their farm 2 years ago. She'd driven down from Austin when Carlos called her, and her voice trembled with emotion as she described watching 3 generations of family history get bulldozed to make room for million-dollar houses. My grandfather bought that land in 1963, she said. He cleared it by hand, built the irrigation system with his own tools, planted every fruit tree in that orchard. The HOA destroyed it all in 6 months. They said our farm stand was commercially inappropriate for a residential area, but we'd been selling vegetables and fruit to our neighbors since before most of them were born. As I listened to these stories, my anger evolved into something colder and more focused. This wasn't just about bureaucratic overreach or zoning disputes. This was about cultural erasure, the systematic destruction of a way of life that had sustained this valley for generations. Margaret Hutchins and her allies weren't just imposing suburban aesthetics. They were wiping out the agricultural heritage that had made Meadowbrook Valley a real community instead of just another cluster of expensive houses. Here's what I think, I said, spreading the federal lease documents across the table. The HOA has been operating under the assumption that they have blanket authority over all properties within their boundaries. But my ranch proves that assumption is wrong. If they can't regulate a federal training facility, then their authority is more limited than they claim. Maria leaned forward, studying the documents. So, you're saying their whole legal foundation might be shaky? I'm saying it's worth investigating. Carlos, you've been fighting them over your auto repair shop. Tom, they shut down your dairy operation. Elena, they destroyed your family's farm. What if we can prove they never had the legal authority to do any of those things? But Jake, Tom said quietly, even if you're right, most of us can't afford to fight them in court. These people have deep pockets and expensive lawyers. That's where the federal angle comes in, I replied. I've got military backing now, real backing, with real legal authority. Colonel Martinez made it clear that the Army doesn't appreciate interference with their training facilities. If we can tie your fights to my fight, we might be able to get federal support for challenging the HOA's entire operation. Elena's eyes lit up with something I hadn't seen there before. Hope. You're talking about more than just defending what we have left. You're talking about getting back what they took from us. I'm talking about justice, I said. And I'm talking about making sure this never happens to anyone else. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning, planning strategies and coordinating resources. Carlos would research the HOA's incorporation documents and legal filings, looking for inconsistencies or procedural violations. Maria would reach out to other horse trainers and livestock owners who'd been targeted by the association. Tom would contact former neighbors who'd been forced out, gauging their interest in joining a coordinated legal challenge. Elena would be our liaison with families who'd already lost their properties, helping us document the pattern of harassment and illegal regulation that had been destroying the valley's agricultural community. And I would work with Colonel Martinez and the military lawyers to understand exactly how far federal protection might extend to neighboring properties. But we all understood that this wouldn't be a quick or easy fight. Margaret Hutchins had spent years building her power base, cultivating relationships with county officials and state legislators, positioning herself as the voice of progress and property values. She had money, political connections, and the backing of dozens of wealthy newcomers who saw the HOA as their investment protection service. What we had was something different. We had history, we had legitimacy, and now we had hope. Most importantly, we had each other, a group of people who understood that some things are worth more than property values and zoning compliance. As my allies prepared to leave that night, Elena Garcia grabbed my arm and looked me straight in the eye. "Jake, you know this is going to get ugly. Margaret Hutchins isn't going to just roll over and accept defeat. She's going to come at you with everything she's got." "Let her come," I replied. "I've got the United States Army backing me up, and I've got neighbors who remember what this valley used to be like. Margaret Hutchins picked this fight, but we're going to finish it." The war for Meadowbrook Valley was about to enter a new phase, not just one stubborn rancher against a homeowners association, but an entire community fighting for its survival against forces that wanted to erase everything that made it special. And for the first time since finding that notice on my gate, I felt like we actually had a chance to win. They came at me with lawyers, threats, and police escorts. What they didn't realize was that I'd already called in reinforcements of my own. Margaret Hutchins didn't take the news about my federal lease agreement well. The morning after my phone call informing her about the military connection, she launched what could only be described as a full-scale legal assault, throwing every resource at her disposal into one final attempt to crush my resistance before I could organize effective opposition. The first wave came in the form of official-looking documents delivered by a process server at 6 a.m., a time clearly calculated to catch me off guard and unprepared. The thick manila envelope contained a temporary restraining order filed in county court, claiming that my ranch operations posed an immediate public safety hazard that required emergency intervention. According to the legal papers, the HOA had convinced a sympathetic judge that my livestock represented a disease vector, my farm equipment created fire hazards, and my unauthorized military activities posed security risks to the surrounding community. The restraining order demanded that I immediately cease all ranching operations, remove all animals from the property, and submit to a comprehensive inspection by county health and safety officials. Reading through the legalese, I could see Margaret Hutchins's handiwork in every line. She'd taken the federal lease agreement, which was supposed to be my trump card, and twisted it into evidence that I was operating some kind of unsupervised paramilitary training camp. The documents painted me as a dangerous extremist using military connections to intimidate peaceful neighbors and avoid legitimate regulatory oversight. But the restraining order was just the opening move. By 8 a.m., my property was surrounded by an impressive convoy of official vehicles: county sheriff's deputies, code enforcement officers, animal control personnel, fire department inspectors, and environmental compliance specialists. It looked like a small invasion force, all coordinated and commanded by Margaret Hutchins herself, who stood at my front gate with a clipboard and a smile that could have cut glass. Sheriff Dan Morrison, no relation to the blacksmith Pete Morrison, who'd been driven out by the HOA, approached my porch with the restraining order in hand. Dan was a decent man caught in an impossible situation, and I could see the discomfort in his eyes as he prepared to serve papers on someone he'd known for 20 years. "Jake, I'm sorry about this, but I've got to serve you with this court order. The county judge signed it yesterday evening, and I'm required to ensure compliance." I took the papers calmly, though my heart was racing. "Dan, do you know what this property is?" Do you understand what the federal lease agreement means? Jake, all I know is what's in these documents. The court says you're operating in violation of county health and safety codes, and I've got to enforce the judge's order. Behind him, Margaret Hutchins was directing her small army of inspectors like a general commanding troops. County code enforcement officials were photographing my barn, my fences, my feed troughs, documenting everything they could use as evidence of violations. Animal control officers were examining my cattle, looking for signs of disease or mistreatment that could justify immediate seizure. Fire department personnel were measuring distances between structures, checking for compliance with regulations that had never been applied to agricultural operations. It was an impressive display of bureaucratic power, designed to overwhelm me with the sheer scope and authority of official disapproval. If I'd been a normal rancher fighting this battle alone, it probably would have worked. The legal costs alone would have bankrupted me, and the time required to fight multiple agencies simultaneously would have made it impossible to maintain ranch operations. But I wasn't fighting alone anymore, and I had resources that Margaret Hutchins didn't know about. "Sheriff Morrison," I said, pulling out my cell phone, "before your people go any further, I think you need to talk to Colonel Sarah Martinez at Fort Hood. This property is under federal lease as a military training facility, which means you might not have jurisdiction here." Dan's expression shifted from uncomfortable duty to genuine confusion. "Jake, what are you talking about? This is private property in our county." "Not during the term of the federal lease. It isn't." I was already dialing Colonel Martinez's direct number, which she'd given me specifically for situations like this. "Colonel, this is Jake McKinnon at the ranch. We've got a situation here that requires your immediate attention." Colonel Martinez's voice was crisp and businesslike, but I could hear the steel underneath. "What kind of situation, Mr. McKinnon?" "Local authorities are attempting to shut down the training facility under a county court order. They're claiming jurisdiction over federal land and demanding inspection of military lease property." There was a pause that seemed to last forever. When Colonel Martinez spoke again, her voice had the kind of cold authority that made people stand at attention, even over the phone. "Mr. McKinnon, put the senior law enforcement officer on the line. Now." I handed the phone to Sheriff Morrison, whose face went through several interesting color changes as he listened to whatever Colonel Martinez was telling him. The conversation lasted about 3 minutes, with Dan saying, "Yes, ma'am," and "I understand, ma'am," at regular intervals. When he finally hung up and handed the phone back to me, he looked like a man who'd just been dressed down by his commanding officer. "Jake, I need to make some phone calls," he said quietly, "and I need to talk to my people about jurisdictional issues." Within minutes, Sheriff Morrison was on his radio, calling his deputies back from their inspection activities. The conversation was brief and decisive. "All units, return to vehicles. We're standing down pending clarification of federal jurisdiction." Margaret Hutchins didn't take this development well. She marched over to where Sheriff Morrison was gathering his people, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Sheriff, what's the meaning of this? You have a valid court order signed by a county judge. This man is in violation of multiple health and safety codes, and he's using some kind of fabricated military connection to avoid legitimate regulatory oversight." Dan Morrison had been sheriff for 15 years, and he'd learned to navigate political pressure from various sources. But there was something in his posture now that suggested he'd just received orders from someone whose authority trumped local politics. "Ma'am, I've been informed that this property may be under federal jurisdiction during the term of a military lease agreement. Until I can verify the legal status with appropriate federal authorities, I can't enforce county ordinances that may be preempted by federal law." "That's ridiculous. This is clearly private property within county boundaries. No federal agency has jurisdiction over homeowners association regulations. Ma'am, that's above my pay grade. I'm going to need legal guidance from the county attorney's office before proceeding. As the sheriff's vehicles pulled away, followed by the county inspectors and animal control officers, Margaret Hutchins was left standing in my driveway with only her clipboard and her rapidly dissolving authority. The impressive display of bureaucratic muscle had evaporated in the face of federal intervention, leaving her looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. But I knew this was far from over. Margaret Hutchins wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and she'd been building her power base for too long to let one setback destroy her campaign. If anything, the federal intervention would make her more dangerous and more desperate. That evening, as I was feeding my cattle and trying to process the day's events, I noticed unusual activity on the county road that bordered my property. Cars were driving slowly past my gate, some of them stopping to take pictures or make phone calls. It wasn't the usual HOA surveillance. This felt more organized, more professional, like someone was conducting reconnaissance for a major operation. Around sunset, Carlos Mendoza called with disturbing news. "Jake, I've been hearing things around town. Word is that Margaret Hutchins has been making phone calls to Austin, talking to state legislators and regulatory agencies. She's claiming that your military connection is some kind of cover for illegal activities, that you're using federal protection to avoid environmental compliance. What kind of illegal activities? Money laundering, tax evasion, unauthorized weapons storage. She's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. And, Jake, some of these people are listening. She's got connections in the state capitol, people who owe her favors from her husband's development projects." This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. Margaret Hutchins was escalating the conflict beyond local politics, bringing in state and potentially federal agencies that might not understand or care about the agricultural heritage of Meadowbrook Valley. If she could convince the right people that my ranch was some kind of criminal enterprise hiding behind military connections, she might be able to override federal protection through superior federal authority. That night, I called Colonel Martinez, again explaining the new developments and the potential for state-level interference. Her response was immediate and reassuring. "Mr. McKinnon, let me be very clear about something. The United States Army does not enter into lease agreements with criminals or extremists. We conduct thorough background checks and security clearances for all our civilian contractors and property partners. If state authorities want to investigate your operation, they're welcome to coordinate with us through proper federal channels." What does that mean in practical terms? It means that any investigation of your property or your activities will be conducted under federal oversight, with military personnel present to ensure that legitimate training operations aren't disrupted. And, Mr. McKinnon, we take a very dim view of false accusations against our civilian partners. But the most important call came just before midnight, from an unexpected source. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. McKinnon? This is General Patricia Hawkins, commanding officer at Fort Hood. I understand you've been having some difficulties with local authorities." I nearly dropped the phone. A two-star general was calling me at midnight about my HOA problems. "Yes, ma'am. The local homeowners association has been trying to shut down my ranching operation, and now they're making accusations about the military training activities on my property. Mr. McKinnon, I want you to understand something. The training exercises conducted on your property are part of a broader counterterrorism preparation program. The facility you provide is critical to maintaining readiness for our special operations personnel. When someone interferes with that training, they're interfering with national security." "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand what I'm telling you, Mr. McKinnon. is that your little HOA problem just became a federal matter involving national security assets. Tomorrow morning, you're going to receive some visitors who will ensure that this situation is resolved quickly and permanently." After she hung up, I sat on my porch in the darkness, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Somehow, Margaret Hutchins's escalating harassment campaign had triggered federal attention at the highest levels. What had started as a dispute over cattle noise and farm equipment had become a matter of national security. In the distance, I could see lights moving along the county road. More surveillance, more reconnaissance, more preparation for whatever Margaret Hutchins was planning as her final assault. But I was no longer worried about her lawyers or her political connections or her bureaucratic allies. Tomorrow, the United States Army was coming to Meadowbrook Valley, and Margaret Hutchins was about to discover that there are some fights you simply cannot win. When the HOA dragged me to a public hearing, they thought it'd be my execution. But the moment I stepped inside with my allies, it became their downfall. The official notice arrived on Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail, and bearing the seal of the Meadowbrook Valley Municipal Authority. Margaret Hutchins had called for an emergency public hearing, ostensibly to address community safety concerns related to my ranch operations, but really to stage a public execution designed to destroy my credibility and intimidate anyone else who might consider resistance. The hearing was scheduled for Saturday evening at 7 p.m. in the Meadowbrook Valley Community Center, a timing clearly calculated to ensure maximum attendance and media coverage. The notice claimed that I was operating an unlicensed military training facility that posed security risks to neighboring properties, and that my pattern of intimidation and federal interference required immediate community intervention. Reading. Through the formal language, I could see Margaret Hutchins's strategy with crystal clarity. She couldn't win a legal battle against federal authority, so she was switching to political warfare, trying to turn public opinion against me by painting me as a dangerous extremist, hiding behind military connections. If she could convince enough people that I was a threat to community safety, she might be able to generate political pressure that would override legal protections. But Margaret Hutchins had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that my allies and I would approach this hearing as defendants, trying to justify our existence to a hostile audience. Instead, we were going to treat it as an opportunity to expose the HOA's pattern of harassment and illegal overreach, with evidence and witnesses that would turn their public execution into their own trial. Friday evening found me in my barn with Carlos, Maria, Tom Bradley, Elena Garcia, and 6 other Valley residents who'd agreed to testify about their experiences with HOA harassment. We'd spent weeks gathering documentation, violation notices, fine schedules, legal correspondence, and, most importantly, evidence that the HOA had been operating outside their legal authority from the beginning. Carlos had done exceptional work, researching the HOA's incorporation documents and legal filings. What he'd found was a pattern of procedural violations and jurisdictional overreach that undermined their entire regulatory structure. "Jake, look at this," he said, spreading county records across a folding table. The HOA was incorporated in 2019, but they've been claiming authority over properties that were established decades before the association existed. They can't legally regulate Tom's Dairy Farm, which was operating under agricultural permits since 1992. They can't regulate Maria's horse training operation, which predates their incorporation by 15 years. Maria nodded grimly. And they knew it. When they first started harassing me, I showed them my original permits and agricultural exemptions. They said those didn't matter anymore because of changed community standards. But if Carlos is right, They never had authority to change anything. Elena Tserev. Garcia had been documenting her family's experience with meticulous detail, and her records painted a picture of systematic intimidation designed to force compliance through exhaustion rather than legal authority. "They fined us 17 times in 6 months," she said, her voice tight with old anger. 17 separate violations for things we'd been doing legally for decades. When we tried to fight one of the fines, they'd hit us with 3 more. It was like fighting quicksand. The more we struggled, the deeper we sank. But our most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley had been quietly recording his interactions with HOA officials, and the recordings revealed Margaret Hutchins and her associates making statements that clearly demonstrated their knowledge that they were operating outside their legal authority. "Listen to this," Tom said, pressing play on a small digital recorder. Margaret Hutchins's voice filled the barn, tinny but unmistakable. "Mr. Bradley, I don't care what your agricultural permits say. This is a residential community now, and we're going to bring it up to residential standards whether you like it or not. Your grandfather's farm permits don't trump property values and community aesthetics." The recording was damning evidence that the HOA had been deliberately ignoring existing legal protections in their campaign to reshape the valley according to their suburban vision. Saturday evening, we arrived at the community center like a military unit deploying for battle. I wore my best suit and carried a briefcase full of federal documents. Carlos brought his research materials and legal analysis. Maria, Elena, Tom, and our other witnesses came prepared with their own evidence and testimony. But we weren't alone. Colonel Martinez had kept her promise about federal oversight, and the parking lot was dotted with unmarked government vehicles and personnel in civilian clothes who were clearly military or federal law enforcement. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This hearing was being monitored by people with serious authority and no patience for local political games. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only and people spilling out into the hallway. Margaret Hutchins had done an excellent job of mobilizing her supporters. Dozens of newcomers who'd moved to the valley in recent years, all dressed in business attire and carrying folders thick with prepared talking points. But I was surprised to see familiar faces in the crowd as well. Neighbors I hadn't talked to in months, old-timers who'd been keeping their heads down during the HOA's reign of terror. Even some families I'd assumed had been completely intimidated into silence. Word had gotten out that this hearing might be more than just a one-sided character assassination, and people were showing up to witness what could be a turning point in the valley's future. Margaret Hutchins presided over the hearing from behind. A long table at the front of the room, flanked by her lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a $1,000 suit, and 3 other HOA board members. She'd clearly expected to control the proceedings like a judge passing sentence on a convicted criminal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's safety and property values. Mr. McKinnon's ranch operations have violated numerous health and safety codes, created ongoing disturbances for neighboring residents, and most recently, he's been using alleged military connections to intimidate legitimate regulatory oversight." She gestured toward a large display board covered with photographs of my property, pictures taken during those midnight trespassing incidents, showing my cattle, my farm equipment, and my facilities from angles that made everything look as threatening as possible. These photographs document ongoing violations of association bylaws, county health codes, and residential zoning regulations. Mr. McKinnon's property has become a magnet for unauthorized military activities, creating security risks and property value concerns for every family in Meadowbrook Valley. It was a polished presentation, delivered with the kind of professional confidence that had probably intimidated dozens of previous targets. But Margaret Hutchins had made a fundamental error. She'd given me the opportunity to respond publicly, with witnesses and evidence, before an audience that included people who remembered what the valley had been like before her suburban revolution. When she finally called my name, I stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room, briefcase in hand and my allies arranged in the front rows like a support battalion. The room fell completely silent, and I could feel the weight of expectations from both sides of this conflict. "Thank you, Ms. Hutchins," I said, setting my briefcase on the table and looking out at the packed room. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these accusations, because I think it's time this community understood exactly what's been happening in Meadowbrook Valley over the past few years." I opened the briefcase and pulled out the federal lease agreement, holding it up so everyone could see the official seals and signatures. "This is a land use agreement between my family's ranch and the United States Department of Defense, signed 15 years ago and renewed twice since then. According to this federal contract, my property serves as a designated training facility for U.S. military personnel, which places it under federal jurisdiction for all matters of zoning, regulation, and local governance." A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't what people had expected to hear. What that means, in practical terms, is that Ms. Hutchins and her homeowners association have been claiming authority they don't possess, issuing violations they can't legally enforce, and harassing my family over activities that are protected by federal law. Margaret Hutchins tried to interrupt. "Mr. McKinnon, your alleged military connection doesn't—" "I'm not finished," I said, my voice carrying enough authority to silence her objection. "And it's not alleged. Colonel Sarah Martinez is here tonight, along with other federal personnel, to verify the authenticity of these documents and explain the legal implications." I gestured toward the back of the room, where Colonel Martinez stood up and nodded to the crowd. Her presence in full-dress uniform sent a clear message about the seriousness of federal involvement. "But this hearing isn't really about my ranch," I continued. "It's about a pattern of harassment and illegal regulation that has been systematically destroying this community for years. Carlos Mendoza, would you please share your research with the community?" Carlos stood up and moved to a microphone that had been set up for public comments. His presentation was calm, methodical, and devastating. "I've spent 3 weeks reviewing the HOA's incorporation documents and legal filings," he said. "What I found was evidence that this organization has been claiming authority over properties and activities that predate their legal existence by decades." He held up thick folders of documentation. "The HOA was incorporated in 2019, but they've been issuing violations against agricultural operations that have been legally established since the 1970s and 1980s. They can't legally regulate activities that were grandfathered under existing permits and agricultural exemptions." The murmur in the crowd was growing louder, and I could see confusion and anger spreading through both sides of the audience. "Moreover," Carlos continued, "their own bylaws limit their authority to properties that specifically agreed to HOA governance through deed restrictions or homeowner agreements. None of the original ranch properties in this valley ever agreed to such restrictions." Elena Garcia was next, and her testimony was the most emotionally powerful of the evening. She described her family's experience with methodical precision, documenting fine after fine, violation after violation, until the legal costs and harassment had forced them to abandon 3 generations of agricultural heritage. "They didn't just drive us off our land," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "They erased our family's history, our contribution to this community, our right to exist in the place where we'd built our lives." But the most damaging testimony came from Tom Bradley, who played his recordings of Margaret Hutchins and other HOA officials making statements that clearly demonstrated their knowledge that they were operating outside their legal authority. Margaret, Hutchins's voice filled the community center. "I don't care what your agricultural permits say. This is a residential community now, and we're going to bring it up to residential standards whether you like it or not." The effect on the crowd was electric. People who'd assumed the HOA was operating under legitimate legal authority suddenly realized they'd been witnessing a systematic campaign of intimidation and regulatory fraud. When the recordings ended, I walked back to the microphone for my closing statement. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard tonight isn't a dispute about zoning or property values. It's evidence of an organization that has been systematically violating the law, exceeding their authority, and destroying the agricultural heritage that made Meadowbrook Valley a real community instead of just another suburban development. I looked directly at Margaret Hutchins, whose face had gone pale during the presentation. "Ms. Hutchins, you tried to take my ranch. You forgot that it belongs to something bigger than your homeowners association. It belongs to the United States of America, and they don't appreciate your interference with their training operations." The crowd erupted into applause, but it wasn't universal. Margaret Hutchins' supporters were clearly shaken, but they weren't ready to concede defeat. Margaret Hutchins herself stood up, her face flushed with anger and desperation. "This is all very dramatic, Mr. McKinnon, but it doesn't change the fundamental facts. Your ranch operations are incompatible with residential property values, your animals create health hazards, and your alleged military connections are just a smokescreen to avoid legitimate regulatory oversight." But before she could continue, Colonel Martinez stood up and walked to the microphone. The room fell completely silent as she adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd with the calm authority of someone accustomed to command. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Colonel Sarah Martinez, Commanding Officer for Off-Site Training Facilities at Fort Hood. I'm here tonight to clarify some misconceptions about Mr. McKinnon's property and its relationship with the United States Army." Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of federal power, and everyone in the room understood that they were hearing from someone whose authority trumped local politics. Mr. McKinnon's ranch serves as a critical training facility for special operations personnel engaged in counterterrorism and homeland security missions. The exercises conducted on his property are essential to maintaining military readiness and protecting national security. She paused, letting that sink in. Any interference with these training operations constitutes interference with federal military activities. The United States Army does not tolerate such interference, whether it comes from individuals, organizations, or local government entities that fail to understand federal jurisdiction. Margaret Hutchins tried one last desperate interruption. "Colonel, surely you can understand our concerns about community safety." Colonel Martinez turned toward her with the kind of look that had probably ended many careers. "Ma'am, the United States Army does not partner with individuals who pose safety risks to their communities. Mr. McKinnon and his family have been thoroughly vetted through federal security clearance processes. If you have specific evidence of criminal activity or safety violations, I encourage you to file a formal complaint with the appropriate federal authorities who will investigate your allegations through proper channels. However," she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "false accusations against federal contractors and frivolous interference with military training operations are serious matters that could result in federal criminal charges." The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret Hutchins sank back into her chair, her face white and her confidence completely shattered. But the evening wasn't over. As Colonel Martinez returned to her seat, people in the crowd began standing up, not Margaret Hutchins's supporters, but longtime Valley residents who'd been silent during years of HOA harassment. Mrs. Sarah Patterson, The 82-year-old widow, who'd been fined for her rose garden, stood up with the help of her walking cane. Her voice was shaky, but determined. "I want everyone here to know what this HOA did to me," she said. "They fined me $700 for roses. I've been growing since 1985. Roses that won ribbons at the county fair. Roses that my late husband planted for our anniversary. They said my flowers violated their aesthetic standards, but those flowers were here before their association even existed." An old rancher named Buck Williams stood up next. "They came after my horses," he said, "claimed the fence around my pasture was visually non-compliant. Hell, that fence has been standing since 1978, and it's kept horses safe for 45 years. But they wanted me to replace it with something that looked like a golf course." One by one, Valley residents began sharing their stories, a catalog of harassment, intimidation, and regulatory overreach that painted a picture of systematic oppression, designed to erase the agricultural character of Meadowbrook Valley. Margaret Hutchins made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she said, standing up and raising her voice over the growing chorus of testimony. "These are isolated incidents taken out of context. The Homeowners Association exists to protect property values and maintain community standards that benefit everyone." "Whose property values?" Elena Garcia shot back from her seat. "My family's property was worth more as a working farm than it ever was as empty lots for McMansions. And whose community standards? We had community standards for 70 years, before you moved here and decided to change everything." The crowd was clearly turning against Margaret Hutchins and her board members. Her supporters, mostly newcomers who'd bought expensive houses in the valley's new developments, were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized they'd been supporting an organization that had been systematically destroying the very character that had attracted them to the area in the first place. Margaret Hutchins' lawyer, who'd been silent throughout the presentation, finally stood up and whispered something urgent in her ear. She nodded reluctantly, then addressed the crowd one last time. "This hearing is adjourned," she announced. "The HOA board will review the information presented tonight and issue a formal response within 30 days. But as people began filing out of the community center, it was clear that something fundamental had changed in Meadowbrook Valley. The spell of intimidation and authority that had allowed the HOA to operate without effective opposition had been broken. People were talking to each other, sharing contact information, planning follow-up meetings. Carlos grabbed my arm as we walked toward the parking lot. "Jake, look around. You see what just happened in there? This isn't just about your ranch anymore. You've given people permission to fight back." He was right. The federal backing had provided the legal protection necessary to challenge the HOA's authority, but the real victory was political and psychological. By standing up publicly and exposing the pattern of harassment with concrete evidence, we'd shown the community that resistance was possible, and that the HOA's power was based more on intimidation than legitimate authority. Colonel Martinez approached me as I reached my truck. "Santui, Mr. McKinnon, that was well done. You handled yourself with professionalism and dignity, and you made your case based on facts rather than emotions." "Thank you, ma'am. I couldn't have done it without federal backing." "Don't underestimate what you accomplished tonight. You organized your community, gathered evidence, and presented a coherent argument for why existing legal protections matter. That's exactly how democracy is supposed to work." But she also had a warning. However, I don't expect Ms. Hutchins to accept this defeat gracefully. People with that kind of personality don't usually back down after public humiliation. Watch yourself, and let us know immediately if there are any attempts at retaliation. As I drove home through the darkness, I could see lights on in houses throughout the valley. People staying up late, probably making phone calls and planning their own resistance strategies. The hearing had been a catalyst, not just for my fight with the HOA, but for a broader community awakening. Margaret Hutchins had wanted to use the hearing to destroy my credibility and intimidate anyone who might consider resistance. Instead, she'd provided a platform for exposing her organization's illegal activities and rallying opposition that had been building for years. The war wasn't over, but tonight felt like a decisive victory. Not just for me, but for everyone in Meadowbrook Valley who believed that some things are more important than property values and suburban aesthetics. The HOA crumbled like a rotten fence, and in the wreckage, something stronger rose from the dust. The collapse of Margaret Hutchins's empire began on Monday morning, 48 hours after the community center hearing that had exposed the HOA's pattern of illegal harassment and regulatory overreach. I was feeding my cattle when Carlos Mendoza called with the first piece of good news we'd had in months. "Jake, you need to turn on Channel 8. They're running a story about the HOA, and Margaret Hutchins is not having a good day." I hurried inside and switched on the television to find a perfectly coiffed news reporter standing in front of the Meadowbrook Valley Community Center with the headline, "Local HOA Accused of Illegal Harassment," scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Federal authorities are investigating allegations that a rural homeowners association exceeded its legal authority in a systematic campaign to force longtime residents off their properties, the reporter announced. The controversy came to light during a heated public hearing Saturday night, where military officials confirmed that at least one targeted property serves as a federal training facility. The story included clips from the hearing, showing Colonel Martinez in uniform explaining federal jurisdiction and Elena Garcia tearfully describing her family's experience with HOA harassment. But the most damaging footage showed Margaret Hutchins herself, caught off guard by a reporter's question as she left the community center. "Ms. Hutchins, how do you respond to allegations that your organization has been operating outside its legal authority?" "No comment," she'd snapped, pushing past the camera with her face twisted in anger. "This is all a misunderstanding that will be resolved through proper legal channels." But even as the news story was broadcasting, those legal channels were moving against her. Carlos had spent the weekend filing complaints with every regulatory agency he could identify: the State Attorney General's office, the County District Attorney, the Texas Real Estate Commission, and the federal authorities responsible for investigating civil rights violations. By Tuesday morning, the first official response arrived in the form of a letter from the Texas Attorney General's office announcing a formal investigation into the HOA's incorporation documents, bylaws, and pattern of enforcement actions. The letter requested that all affected property owners file detailed complaints documenting their experiences with HOA harassment. Wednesday brought even better news. The County District Attorney's Office announced that they were reviewing potential criminal charges related to the HOA's midnight trespassing incidents on my property. The photographs I'd taken during those floodlight confrontations, combined with the property damage from cut fences and destroyed gate locks, provided clear evidence of criminal activity. But the most satisfying development came on Thursday, when Margaret Hutchins' own lawyer withdrew from representing the HOA. The expensive suit from Austin apparently decided that federal criminal exposure wasn't worth whatever the HOA was paying him, leaving Margaret Hutchins scrambling to find new legal representation. Friday afternoon, Elena Garcia called with news that brought tears to my eyes. "Jake, you're not going to believe this. The County Planning Commission just revoked the development permits for the property where our farm used to be. Turns out the environmental impact studies were fraudulent, and the water usage calculations violated state regulations. regulations. What does that mean for your family? It means the developer can't build those McMansions, and the property might be available for agricultural use again. My cousins are already talking to a lawyer about buying it back and restoring the orchards. But Margaret Hutchins wasn't going down without one final desperate fight. The following Monday, she attempted to call another emergency HOA meeting, supposedly to address false allegations and media distortions. The meeting notice claimed that outside agitators were spreading malicious propaganda designed to destroy property values and community stability. This time, fewer than a dozen people showed up, all members of her inner circle, the developers and newcomers who'd supported her suburban transformation campaign from the beginning. The community center, which had been packed beyond capacity the week before, felt empty and abandoned. Carlos, Maria, Tom Bradley and I attended as observers, sitting in the back row and watching Margaret Hutchins try to rally her remaining supporters. Her presentation was a rambling, bitter tirade against federal interference and media bias, but the fight had gone out of her voice. She looked tired, defeated, diminished. The real estate values in this community have increased by 30% since the Homeowners Association was established, she insisted. We've brought order, standards, and stability to an area that was previously chaotic and unregulated. But even her remaining supporters seemed uncomfortable with her tone and her increasingly desperate arguments. When she called for a vote of confidence in HOA leadership, 3 of her own board members abstained, effectively ending her reign as the Valley's suburban dictator. After the meeting, Margaret Hutchins approached me in the parking lot. For a moment, I thought she might try one final confrontation, but her body language suggested something closer to surrender. "Mr. McKinnon," she said quietly, "I want you to know that everything I did was for the good of this community. I was trying to protect property values and maintain standards that would benefit everyone." I looked at her for a long moment, trying to summon some sympathy for a woman whose empire had crumbled around her. But I kept thinking about Elena Garcia's family farm, bulldozed to make room for cookie-cutter houses. I thought about old Pete Morrison, driven from the blacksmith shop his family had operated for generations. I thought about Sarah Patterson, fined for growing roses in her own yard. "Ms. Hutchins," I said finally, "you weren't protecting anything. You were destroying everything that made this valley worth protecting. You mistook conformity for community and control for leadership." She stood there for a moment, perhaps waiting for me to say something more conciliatory. When I didn't, she walked to her car and drove away. 2 weeks later, she and her husband put their house on the market and moved back to Dallas, leaving behind the suburban revolution they'd tried to impose on Meadowbrook Valley. The formal dissolution of the HOA came in stages over the following months. The state attorney general's investigation found multiple violations of incorporation law and regulatory procedures. The county district attorney filed criminal charges for trespassing and property damage. The Texas Real Estate Commission revoked several development permits based on fraudulent environmental studies. But more importantly, the community itself began healing and rebuilding. Properties that had been cited for violations were officially cleared when investigators determined that the HOA had lacked authority to issue the citations in the first place. Farmers and ranchers who'd been driven out began returning, purchasing land from developers who could no longer get permits for suburban developments. Elena Garcia's family was among the first to return, buying back their ancestral property and beginning the long process of restoring the orchards that had been destroyed. Pete Morrison's son relocated his blacksmith operation from Cedar Park back to the valley, setting up shop in the same building where his grandfather had worked for decades. The dairy operation that had sustained Tom Bradley's family for 30 years was more complicated to restore. But within 6 months he had a small herd back on the land and was selling milk to local families again. The county even expedited his permit renewals, apparently eager to demonstrate support for agricultural operations after the HOA scandal. 1 year after finding that eviction notice on my gate, I rode thunder across my property on a crisp autumn morning, surveying the valley that had become home to my family 70 years ago. The seasonal training exercises were scheduled to begin next week, with Army personnel conducting reconnaissance and survival training in the hills behind my house. But the military connection, which had been crucial to defeating Margaret Hutchins's harassment campaign, had become just one part of a larger community renaissance. The valley was attracting new residents again, not suburban refugees looking for manicured lawns and homeowners association rules, but families who appreciated working landscapes and agricultural heritage. Carlos had expanded his auto repair business, adding a small fabrication shop that served farmers and ranchers throughout the county. Maria's horse training operation was booked solid with clients from Austin and San Antonio who wanted their animals trained in a rural environment that felt authentic rather than artificial. Sarah Patterson, now 83, had expanded her rose garden to include varieties from every decade since the 1940s, creating a living history of horticulture that attracted visitors from throughout the region. The County Tourism Bureau had designated her garden as a heritage site, bringing in revenue that helped support other agricultural preservation efforts. But the most significant change was less tangible and more fundamental. The community had remembered what it meant to stand together against forces that threatened their way of life. People who'd been isolated and intimidated during the HOA's reign of terror had rediscovered their collective voice and their shared commitment to preserving something authentic in an increasingly artificial world. On that autumn morning, as I watched my cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that had been threatened with suburban development just months before, I thought about my father and grandfather and the legacy they'd entrusted to my care. They'd built something lasting on this land, not just a successful ranching operation, but a way of life that respected the relationship between people and the land that sustained them. Margaret Hutchins and her HOA had tried to erase that legacy with violation notices and compliance demands, but they'd fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting against. This wasn't just private property that could be regulated into submission. This was heritage, community, and a bond between generations that ran deeper than any suburban aesthetic could reach. The victory in Meadowbrook Valley proved something important about American democracy and community resilience. Bullies can build rules and bureaucratic structures designed to intimidate and control, but they can't break a people who understand their own history and stand together to defend what matters most. As I rode back toward the house, I could see Colonel Martinez's convoy approaching along the county road, the beginning of another training exercise that would help prepare American soldiers for missions around the world. But more importantly, I could see neighbors working their land, children playing in yards, and families building lives in a community that had remembered how to fight for its own survival. The HOA had tried to kick me off my ranch, not realizing I leased it to the military. But in the end, the real battle wasn't about federal jurisdiction or legal technicalities. It was about the kind of community we wanted to build and the kind of legacy we wanted to leave for future generations. Margaret Hutchins had lost that battle, but Meadowbrook Valley had won something much more important: the right to remain true to itself in a world that often confuses conformity with progress and control with community. Justice had come to the valley, not in the form of legal victories or regulatory compliance, but in the form of a community that had rediscovered its own strength and refused to let anyone erase the heritage that made it home.